We have had 3 overlanding vehicles: a Land Rover Discovery,
And a what?
a Land Rover Defender, and finally a Mercedes-Benz Unimog. Join us as we look back on our adventures in each of these unique vehicles. 2010 was our first major overlanding trip. For the first time in 25 years, the Cooper Creek Ferry was operating. We just had to go.
And that is the road to Birdsville. It's the long way round.
A 300-kilometre detour via Beadell. Our setup was pretty basic. We removed the back seats and carried 60 litres of water and 40 litres of diesel in jerry cans. We had a fridge, ammo boxes for supplies, and a table on the back door. The next morning, we set out for Birdsville. We came across this old farmhouse, a perfect place to stop and take photos. The road was muddy and in bad condition. We finally made it and stopped to refuel. It was deserted. We checked the road was open and headed straight for the Birdsville track and Mungarani. There was a lot of water on the road. We checked depth and stuck to the middle where most of the gravel would be. We found a dry spot behind a sand dune and camped for the night. It was pretty cold, so a campfire was welcome warmth and a good opportunity for photos. The next morning we set out early and reached Mungarani. We topped up with diesel and with another couple set out for the Cooper Creek Ferry.
Is anyone on channel out here?
Yeah, mate, yep. Just turned from the Birdsville track onto the bypass heading south.
Hello, mate. How many vehicles are there?
2 of us and a camel.
And a what?
A camel. He's guiding us through at the moment.
To reach the ferry, you need to take quite a long detour. When we arrived, we were surprised to find a small single-vehicle ferry. It was a slow but fantastic trip across. Back on the track, there was still a lot of water. It was slow going. Lake Eyre was full, and we heard that you could get flights to see it from William Creek. We were excited to see it from the air. It was spectacular. The pilot was surprised to see this camel crossing the water. He did a few stomach-turning loops to get a better view. After that, we got back on the road to Maori. It was still very wet. Maori is a small outback town. It used to be one of the stops on the old Ghan Railway. This carriage is all that's left. We heard about an old abandoned town called FERRY that was a good place to camp. The weather had turned and it was cold, wet and rainy. The next morning we continued on the Strzelecki track. There were quite a few trucks. Being able to communicate with them is vital, as it's difficult to see what's coming if you need to overtake. With all the rain, the desert was in full bloom, but thankfully, no flies. We were told about a nice shortcut to Cameron's Corner. It was a great decision to try it. It was beautiful. The desert had come alive, and was a sea of colour. Along the way, we found an old yellow bus. Turns out it was quite a famous landmark. Out here, there's always a reason to stop and take photos. The road is never boring. This echidna was digging right next to the side of the road. And this emu dad was proudly showing off his chicks. Cameron's Corner is the intersection of Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia. We stopped to take a photo and then carried on to spend the night at Fort Grey.
One of the homesteads.
It was still cold and wet, but the area was beautiful and green. The wildflowers were blooming and the lake was full. The next morning we headed out towards Tibooburra. There was a rather large obstacle though.
Perform a U-turn when possible.
We performed a U-turn, waited for the locals to get off the road and got back on the cut line. It is 127 kilometres dead straight to Waneering. The road was open, but it was in bad condition. This wallaby sat in the road waiting for her Joey to hop into the pouch before hopping out of the way. Even in the wet, it is very dusty. We finally reached the gate in the wild dog fence. The fence is built to keep dingoes and wild dogs out of New South Wales. Sealed roads are rare out here.
Just put a piece of asphalt down. Just make them think they're out of it. And they'll suddenly stop it. It'll be really funny.
It was back to dirt again. We were getting a bit tired of it by now.
Someone with a real big sense of humor. And we're back. The tar road. So happy.
From there, it was a quick 900 kilometres back home. In 2013, we had been married for 25 years, so we decided to take a few months and do something special. We met our family in Denham on the west coast and renewed our vows. This is our journey back home. Steep Point is the most western point of mainland Australia, with cliffs that overlook the ocean. It was very windy up there. We found a fantastic cave that gave us a bit of shelter and a brilliant place to take photos. The area is known for its king waves. They roll in and crash up the side and over the cliffs. You have to be very careful near the edges. Our Defender started life as a stock vehicle. Of course, Ian decided it needed a few modifications. We removed the back seats, installed a safety barrier, storage drawers, a dual battery system and a 240-volt inverter. A 100-litre water tank was on the floor behind the seats. Every last bit of space was used. On the outside, he installed gull wing windows. We had a safety devices roll cage as well as a bull bar and a winch. We bought a new rooftop tent and awnings from Gordy Gear. He did all this while still building the Unimog. We loved our Discovery, but the Defender was a far better option for doing this type of trip. It is bigger and has a far larger carrying capacity. From Steep Point, we headed slightly north towards Kennedy Ranges National Park. Along the way, we came across the old coach road. Built in the 1920s for wagons drawn by either horses or camels, it was the main route to Exmouth. The Kennedy Ranges was still a fair distance away. We ended up driving late, something we don't normally do, but our lights made it a lot easier. The campground was fantastic and the scenery spectacular. We did a lot of hiking and saw some amazing places, like Honeycomb Gorge. It was incredibly hot and dry. We came across these massive boulders that had tumbled down at some point. We wished we could stay longer, but had to head to LAVERTON and the Beadell before our permits expired. We restocked, refueled, and registered at the police station before spending the night at the start of the track. Our first stop was the abandoned Yeo homestead. We discovered the water pump still worked. It was a bit of work to pump and carry, but I had my first proper shower in weeks. We were excited to see what lay ahead. There are a lot of historical and survey markers along the way. We stopped and collected firewood along the way for the cooler evenings. We were surprised to find a very well-equipped rest stop to spend the night. One of the markers on the map was the site of a plane wreck. It's a way off the track, but we decided to take a drive out there. Many sand dunes later, and we arrived. In 1993, a Goldfields Air Service plane crash-landed after losing both engines. The plane was pretty intact, but over the years it has been gradually stripped. The dunes out here gave us plenty of opportunity to do some photos. We were surprised by the many wildflowers. The Sturt Desert Pea is a personal favorite, but there were many others thriving in this harsh landscape. The Ilkirka Roadhouse was the only fuel stop along the way. It supports the isolated communities out here, but is not always open. We were sure we had enough fuel for the trip, but we topped up the tank just in case. From Ilkirka, we crossed the state border into South Australia. From here, the track has not been maintained since it was built in the 1950s. The track was built by Len Beadell and his gun barrel crew to support the rocket range in Woomera. It is named after his wife Anne. For the final stage, he was joined in his trusty Land Rover by Anne and his 5-month-old daughter Connie Sue. The Anne Beadell crosses the northern end of Serpentine Lakes, a clay pan covered in a layer of salt. A great opportunity for some unique photos. Back on the road, it was slow going. In the 5 days, we saw one other vehicle, a reminder of just how isolated this area is. There was no place to pull over on the track, but we stopped often to stretch our legs and take photos. I had my stilettos from our renewal ceremony, and we used them often in our photos. There are a lot of camels out here. These guys refused to get off the road. We pulled over and waited 10 minutes for them to get ahead of us and hopefully leave the track. We had stopped beside one of Len's many survey marks. Back on the road and around the corner, the camels. This time we stopped and had lunch. We found this random yield sign in the middle of nowhere. The track is incredibly varied. There was an abundance of these purple flowers. Imagine sitting in a field of flowers in the desert. Out here, having a purpose each day is important. For us, it was to take as many unique photos as possible. We were getting close to Emu, the site of the first atomic bomb test on the Australian mainland. The track was endless, desolate, and in some places very rough. In the middle of this vast landscape, Len was asked to find a suitable runway so dignitaries could be brought to the atomic test sites. After 3 months of searching, he came over a sandhill and found this clay pan, a mile long, which he knew was the perfect natural runway. Just further down the track is a totem marking the site of the first bomb. It is safe enough to visit, but we only stayed long enough to take a few photos. It was surreal to see how devastating it still was to the area. Back on the track, we were getting closer to the end. The road conditions rarely changed here. It was bad. The corrugations were large and endless. We had to take frequent breaks as the vibration and noise was just terrible. The road was so bad in some places, people had made tracks around the worst sections. It was much slower, but by this stage, slower was far better. After a rough section, we heard a loud rattling noise. We stopped to investigate. Luckily, it was just a broken stone shield. Back on the road, and a few hours later, we got to the dog fence. We were done. It was time to stop and have a well-deserved coffee and a celebration. Our trusty Land Rover had taken us 1,300 kilometers through one of the most remote areas in Australia with no issues. We came across a motorbike expedition. We stopped to have a chat and warn them about the severe corrugations. They decided to push on anyway. We heard later that their trailer didn't make it far and had to be recovered. From there, it was on to Peake. Peake, which means white man in a hole in the local language, is an opal mining town in the northern part of South Australia. Most of the buildings are partly or completely underground, as it is incredibly hot out here. There are a lot of tours and places to explore. We decided to have a few nights of luxury in the incredible underground motel. While exploring, we even found an old spaceship. One of the must-do things is a visit to the breakaways in the painted desert. The landscape is surreal and barren. It is like standing inside a watercolor painting. It was a fantastic opportunity to do some amazing photos. The next day we left for Unimog, driving through the painted desert. We made a stop for lunch and to refuel at the famous Pink Roadhouse. From there we got onto the Unimog track. It was great to stop and explore the abandoned stations of the old gang railway. We saw a sign for the Peake ruins and decided to have a look. Turns out it was quite a long way, but it was well worth the drive. It has an interesting and varied history. First a settlement abandoned due to drought, then becoming a repeater station for the old telegraph line. It was abandoned after the telegraph line was moved. Finally, copper was discovered, but the quality was poor and could not sustain the cost of the smelter. So once again, it was abandoned. We spent a day and a night just exploring the area. Officially opened in 1899, this beautiful bridge was part of the old railway. It still stands proud and is testament to the engineers and workmen of those days. One of the problems on the roads out here are the bull dust holes. The surface looks solid, but it's actually fine powder. We came to a rest stop. It had what is known as a mound with spring water. An amazing sight. From here we headed towards FERRY. This time the weather was great and we could spend time exploring the old town. The Strzelecki track was even busier this time. Communication with the trucks is essential as you cannot see what is ahead. It was so hot, and with very little shade, the birds had claimed the picnic shelter. The shortcut to Cameron's Corner was very different this time, dry and barren. And the yellow bus had gone. After a stop for a photo at Cameron's Corner, we went back to Fort Grey. It had changed, but made an incredible backdrop for photos. Once the sun was up, out came the flies. The locals look for any shade, even the side of a post. We got back to the east coast and went up to Fraser Island. We spent a wonderful few days relaxing and enjoying the ocean, something we hadn't seen in a month. From there we headed to Cape Byron, the easternmost point of the Australian mainland. We had gone ocean to ocean through the desert, an incredible feeling. In 2015, our truck was finally finished. In January of 2016, we took off on what would be a 9-month trip around Australia. The big difference this time was if we found a spot we liked, we could stay for a week or more without having to worry. The truck was robust enough that we could take on anything without having to prepare, other than taking on food, fuel, and water. We have seen some fantastic places, and things often so remote, not many others have been there. Our outdoor living has also evolved, from shade cloth and tarps to a custom-built annex that is weatherproof.
As you can see, the rain is sheeting down.
In the truck, weather is no longer a problem. We can cook indoors. We have a really good bed with a comfortable mattress. We also have a toilet and shower, and most important, coffee.
My coffee at long last.
Our Unimog is comfortable to drive on-road and off-road. Its height lets you see over the bushes, unlike the Defender. Corrugations are not as bad in the truck. We can set up for a night or a week in a few minutes. In the Land Rovers, it was always good to be home, but the Unimog is home. Thanks for watching. We hope you have enjoyed these journeys as much as we have.